Welcome to Class 5 for Hebrew Exegesis, BRITE Old Testament 506. Today we'll be completing our examination of how to do word studies on words in the Hebrew Bible, as well as looking at usages of the different tenses and aspects of the verb. So let's jump in. In last week's lesson, we mentioned three primary areas or contexts in which we need to examine the usage of a word in the Old Testament. The authorial context, how does the author use this word? The literary context, what is surrounding the word, how does the word get used in other places in the Old Testament, not written by the same author, and semantic context, which is where we're going to look today. When I say semantic context, I'm referring to the word itself. What is the semantic field of the word? That is, what has the word historically denoted? What does the word refer to? What does the word itself, as you would look it up in a dictionary or as you would seek to break down the parts of the word itself, what does that word mean? Sometimes we're talking about etymology, the history of the word, but oftentimes we're also talking about the history of the root. That is lemmatization, because the root of the word is often within linguistics called a lemma, which is just a fun thing to say, lemmatization. But really we're trying to get to the history of the root, to understand where our particular word comes from. We're also examining semantically the cognate languages, other Semitic languages where this word has been used, or where we see allusions to this word, or where we see development of the root of our word being used in that other language. All of these go to shed light on the particular definition of our word beyond what you would simply find in a dictionary or a lexicon. We're looking at the dictionary or the lexicon, but we're taking it deeper than that because we're examining the root, not just what the lexicon says about the word, but what the root itself means. That will shed light on the semantic understanding of the word in the semantic field. However, I have to issue a warning here, and that is that this system of semantic context can actually be abused in our research. For instance, if we were looking at butter and we were looking at flies, we can't make the argument that we put them together and get butterfly, because a butterfly has absolutely nothing to do with butter. So we need to be careful as we're breaking down the supposed roots and as we're looking at the cognate languages. For instance, looking at the word for butterfly in Spanish is not going to shed any light on what a butterfly is. So we need to be very careful as we're walking through this process that we're examining the word in its historical root and in its cognate languages, and yet at the same time being careful not to overstep and become illogical. Let's look now at an example of semantic context in the examination of the root of a word from 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 9. This is the story of where Saul and his servant are looking for the lost donkeys, and they say, let's go visit Samuel. However, we're given a little note that tells us that the Navi was in those days called a roeh. The question, though, is, does roeh mean prophet? A Navi is a prophet. Does that mean that a roeh is a prophet? After all, almost every instance of roeh in the Old Testament is used interchangeably with Navi. However, when we look at the root of roeh, we realize that the root is ra'ah, and that roeh is actually a participle of ra'ah, ra'ah meaning to see. And so we realize that roeh is the seer, or literally the seer, the one who sees. So this is emphasizing a particular part of the job of a prophet, to be able to see into the future. And here we have Samuel doing that as he anoints Saul as king and tells him what happened to the donkeys, and also tells Saul what's going to happen on his way home, all of which comes true because the seer was able to see the future and was able to understand what was taking place. He saw the future, he saw visions, he saw God meeting with him in some instances, or the angel of the Lord in others. And so we understand an even deeper level of what it means that somebody is a roeh because we grasp that it comes from the root of ra'ah. It's not just a prophet, but it's emphasizing a particular part of being a prophet, that is, seeing visions. Examining the roots can be extremely helpful when we have words that only occur a few times. For instance, last week in our lecture we looked at Genesis 1:2, marachephet. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And we realize that marachefet only occurs once in the entire Old Testament. However, the root rahaf also occurs in Deuteronomy chapter 32 in reference to an eagle, yarachef. So we were able to understand that marachefet has to do with hovering, similar to hovering like an eagle, hovering protectively over the waters or preparing to guide and to do something, just as the eagle in Deuteronomy is used to describe God guiding the people in the wilderness and protecting them like an eagle protects its young. So we're able to use the root of marachefet in order to examine other instances of this word in the Old Testament. So how do we go about determining the root of our word? Well, for starters, we can simply examine the word itself and see if we can identify the three root letters. But either way, we're eventually going to have to look the word up in a lexicon or a Hebrew dictionary. One, to see what possible definitions there are for our root, and to confirm if we indeed have the right root. In some instances, we'll find out that there are several words that share the same letters that do not actually come from the same root. That's the caution at the bottom of this page, false cognates. Just because a word has dalet, beit, resh does not mean that it automatically comes from the same root, davar. Davar can mean to speak, but dever, which also has dalet, beit, resh, can mean to subdue. So we need to be very careful about how exactly we go about examining the word in its roots within the lexicon. We also need to examine the words that our lexicon says are similar in root to the word that we're examining. For instance, as we were looking at the PL participle marachefet, we also looked at the PL imperfect. There may, however, be a noun form of our word or an adjectival form of our word, and we need to look that word up too to see what influence it'll make in our understanding of our word, and also to confirm if it does indeed make an impact upon our word. For instance, rachaf also shows up in Jeremiah, and yet there it talked about his bones fluttering, which is not quite the picture that we're looking for of the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters. I'm sure if we go back in the etymology and history of the word far enough, we'll see that rachaf can mean fluttering or mean hovering, and that the two are somehow connected. For instance, we might picture the bones fluttering, but also a bird fluttering, but over time those two seem to have moved apart from one another. So examining each of the words that come from our root in their context can also be helpful to determine which of those actually impacts our understanding of the word. Again, all of this is a lot of work, but it comes about by looking at the lexicon, examining the roots, examining those words that come from the roots that are similar to our word, and then building our understanding of that word off of our research. As we're examining the cognate roots of the word within Semitic context, we need to differentiate between textual criticism and cognate studies. In cognate studies, examining the Peshitta or the Septuagint will probably not be helpful in telling us the historical understanding of a particular Semitic root, because while Syriac comes from Aramaic, which is a Semitic language, it's very late, further on in history than Hebrew, and the Septuagint is in Greek, which is not a Semitic language. Textual criticism uses both the Peshitta and the Septuagint in order to show us what the correct word is, in terms of looking at the translation in both of those and trying to reverse engineer what the Hebrew word is they were examining. But it's not actually looking at the root of the Hebrew word, as we do in cognate studies. But even then, both those documents can be helpful as we examine them, because they may tell us the understanding of both the Septuagint and the Peshitta, how they understood the connotation of a particular word. But usually this is not as helpful as it may seem, because the Septuagint and the Peshitta are simply taking a Hebrew word and translating it into their respective language. So only in particular situations will the actual translation be helpful in telling us how they understood it. More often, when we're talking about cognate studies, we're looking at words that are closer, that have propinquity, that is, that they are closer to Hebrew, either in the history of the language or in the geography of the ancient Near East. So we're talking about languages like Hittite and Ugaritic, Arabic, even Proto-Semitic, which comes long before any of these languages. Even to some degree Egyptian and hieroglyphics, as we're understanding the influence that those languages may have had upon Israel. As we're looking at these words, we may realize things like differentiations between Canaanite and non-Canaanite languages. For instance, in Hebrew, shalom means peace. In Arabic, it's salam. And we know from Ugaritic and other languages that Canaanite languages, which Ugaritic is not, but we know that Canaanite languages had a tendency to make a long A into an O, what we often call the Canaanite shift. And so by comparing Hebrew to these other languages, we're able to see the differences, but also to see the influence that these other languages may have upon our word. We do need to be careful, though. Just because words share the basic root from language to language doesn't mean that they share influence. They may have actually grown apart over time, or we may simply be looking at words that had a common ancestor but now no longer do. And so we need to be very careful about how exactly we go about our cognate studies. Let me give just two quick examples of where cognate roots can be helpful. In Proverbs 26:23, we read, Kesef sigim. The question is, though, does this mean silver dross? Kesef means silver. Sig means dross in Hebrew. However, our cognates from Ugaritic tells us that actually the kaf is a preposition, as, and the samek, the pei, the samek, and the gimel are actually a four-letter root from Ugaritic that means glaze. So these are like glazed, which makes a whole lot more sense than silver dross, because he's talking about something fake that's going on top of a particular piece of earthenware, just as lies and such can be fake. And so this particular use of the cognate is very helpful in understanding what exactly the writer is saying. The same is true in Psalm chapter 1. In Psalm 1 we read, Ashrei ha'ish, which we often translate as happy is, or oh, the happiness and the blessedness. However, Ashrei potentially comes from an Akkadian root that has to do with striding. So this man is blessed because his striding, his path is blessed. And so we have a better understanding of what exactly the psalmist intended based upon an Akkadian cognate of the same word. So this is the value of cognates, being able to compare one language to the other and get an understanding of the nuance or perhaps the shared history of particular words. So where exactly do we find the roots? Well, again, we have to look in our lexicons and our Hebrew dictionaries. Understanding that Brown, Driver, Briggs is somewhat out of date and the cognate information emphasizes Arabic. Instead, we probably need to look at the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, because that is a far more recent lexicon and has much better understanding of the cognates of other languages. But we also need to look in commentaries and journals and word books, because these will also shed light upon our particular root, as commentators and scholars debate where a particular word may have come from. In the end, though, we need to not only gather the data, we then need to compare the data. Just because we found the word in another language, we need to think critically about the use of that word. For instance, in both Arabic and Hebrew, we have kesem, and in Arabic and Hebrew, we have lechem. But in Arabic, kesem means part, whereas in Hebrew, it has to do with divination or looking to see the future. Some lexicons even say magic. In Arabic, lechem means meat. In Hebrew, it means bread. And yet neither of those are actually connected to one another based upon what they actually denote, and yet they reveal the fact that they probably have a common ancestor having to do with food, lechem. Kesem, how we put part and divination together, is a mystery, and so these two are probably not true cognates. And so we need to be careful as we're examining these words to make sure, once again, that we're examining our research critically, making sure that it's helpful and not actually leading us down a false path towards false cognates. Just because the words sound the same or appear to have the same roots doesn't mean they're actually connected. But where they are connected and where we've confirmed it with lexicons and dictionaries and journals, we're able to use that information to better understand our particular word within the Hebrew text. Once we have thoroughly examined the semantic context of a word, we're ready to put that information back into our overall word study, combining it with authorial context and literary context. Our author most likely knew the semantic context of a word when he chose it. However, sometimes authors will choose a particular word, ironically, because of its semantic context, using the word in a different way or even in a comedic sort of way to emphasize a particular point. We also understand that semantic context has to do with denotation. How is the word typically understood within a dictionary as we would define it, as we're examining all the different inputs from various languages to give us an understanding of our particular word? How is this word then used within its literary context as we examine its connotation? How those other surrounding words change or nuance the particular information that we're looking at. So once we have accomplished our research, examining it in all of these parts, examining it in lexicons and commentaries and word books as necessary, we're able to come to a conclusion, either agreeing with the lexicon's decision or perhaps adding just a little bit of nuance based upon our examination. I'd like to shift gears a little bit and look at some Hebrew grammar, specifically verbs. We've looked at the perfect and the imperfect in elementary Hebrew, talking about the aspect of incomplete and completed action or tense, past, present, future, but there are other usages of both of these in the Old Testament. For instance, the perfect, the katal, can be used for the prophetic future, something that's in the future but is so guaranteed that it's spoken of as though it's already been completed. So that we read in Isaiah 9:1, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light, and yet we understand that what is meant is they will see a great light. Lamentations 1:21 is also similar in that there is an optative use or a wish, a desire, talking about the nations saying they have heard, they have rejoiced, and then because of that, so you will do and you will bring. But these you will do and you will bring is really a prayer on behalf of the lamenter who's praying that God would indeed do these things. And the verse finishes with his declaration that they, the nations, will be just as I am. And so this is clearly a future. It doesn't exist yet, but he wishes that it would. So he uses a perfect form. These are just two examples of a handful of examples in the Old Testament where the typical aspect or tense of the perfect that we would expect is not quite the usage. So we need to be careful as we're translating that we don't woodenly translate everything we come across, but instead examine it within its context to see what other usages of the verb may be in question. The yiktol form, the imperfect, is also used in some unusual ways. For instance, in Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 12, the imperfect is actually used to reference the past. Yerashum, they seized them, talking about taking the land from the Horites on behalf of the Edomites, seizing Mount Seir. This is a historical past, and so it talks about what was being done or what was accomplished, and yet it's still a usage of the imperfect to designate the past. The same is true of the preposition before, terem. It is always followed by the yiktol imperfect, such as Genesis 2:5, before any bush was on the earth. There's also an aspect of the imperfect that references ongoing action, such as Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 44, that talks about what bees do. They don't just do it once, but they continue to do it. And so while we might expect a perfect form of just this is what bees do, that iterative, durative, ongoing process indicates that we need an imperfect verb here to give that nuance. The imperfect can also be used to indicate repeated, non-ongoing action, such as Genesis 37:15, where Joseph looked several times, looking in different places for his brothers. What are you looking for? Ma tabakash. As somebody asks him, what are you looking for? He's looking for his brothers, repeatedly, in different cities. We also have instances where something is repeated or is ongoing in the past, and yet we still use the imperfect, such as Genesis 2:6, where a mist was going up from the earth. It went up every day to water the earth, apparently, in the early morning hours of each day, and so we use an imperfect here to indicate that it was ongoing. It didn't stop, it kept doing this, but it was a past event. And sometimes, as in Genesis 42, verse 37, we use the imperfect to indicate permission, where Reuben, in a insert foot into mouth sort of situation, says that if he doesn't bring Benjamin back safely, Jacob has permission to kill each of Reuben's two sons. Again, permission here is indicated by tamit, the imperfect, you may kill. Two final usages to highlight here of the yiktol imperfect. In Leviticus 19:32, the word is used almost volatively, almost as an imperative. In the presence of gray hair, you must rise. And in 2 Samuel 15:4, Absalom uses the imperfect as a wish or a desire, literally saying, who will appoint me as a judge in the land? But he's really saying, oh, that I were. Oh, I wish somebody would do this, looking to the future. So again, as we're examining the particular aspect or tenses of the katal and the yiktol, the perfect and the imperfect, we need to make sure that we're capturing the nuance of the particular word in the context of the verse. Our lecture today was not particularly long, but it was quite technical, so make sure you go back through and examine anything that you don't quite understand. Watch this video as many times as necessary. Be working on your word study that'll be due in a week. Also be checking on your vocab and studying that, and I will see you in class.